Well, it was about 2 feet long and it was in white.
Oh, it was about 6 inches by about 12, 15 inches.
It was everywhere. I've seen it. I've even seen it outside my own place on the corner of the street.
Sometimes it was half smudged out, but often it was very clear.
Oh, I suppose the E would be a whole 2 feet from top to bottom.
I used to come down from Newcastle to the big city, you know, to go to the theatre, and we'd see this beautifully written word, you know, yellow chalk, beautiful copperplate. We didn't know who wrote it, or we had a rough idea of what it meant, but to us all, I think it was just part of the exotic nature of Sydney. You know, there was this wonderful sort of somebody funny's going around writing eternity on the pavements.
Out the front of the Commonwealth Bank, just there on the asphalt, the word eternity written in chalk, which was pretty remarkable for me. Living in the country, I would never have seen a word written on a street. It just wasn't part of country living. And just even the black asphalt background seemed fairly impressive.
When I first saw it, I was quite startled to be suddenly walking down the street. It was night time, and these white letters to come up and look at you and say eternity.
There was just something about it, and it never crossed my mind that it was a fake.
It would appear on footpaths, sometimes near buildings, sometimes right out near the curb, in the city, in the suburbs, all over the place.
I would have been only a schoolboy, I'd say, when I first saw it. I can't remember exactly when, but that was about the time. And I'm 80 years of age now, so it was a fair while ago.
I have seen it when looks like it's almost been written. In other words, you're hot on the scene.
Yeah, back in the 60s, there was quite a common sight around Sydney. A bit of a mystery writing it actually was. Sort of written by the Phantom, I suppose.
In books lies the soul of the whole past time, the articulate, audible voice of the past, when the body and material substance of it have altogether vanished like a dream.
Over the crooked roots of Wallara, the moon sailed, poking her face in at the window in Moller Street, where Beth lay, smiling gently in Len's arms, where the tiny bat fluttered and crept from the jacaranda tree onto the landing, on over the sleeping city to crease the folds of Shirl's wedding dress with moonlight, to weep with Dawny over her stray cat in Burns Lane. At 4:36 a.m. she gazed with jealous awe at this celestial interloper whirling through space at 30 degrees elevation. At dawn, while Al and Beryl still slept soundly, a little man in a stiff starched collar and a high-crowned felt hat squatted outside the iceworks in Oxford Street and printed in perfect copperplate the one word, eternity. Well, I was looking for images that pushed the feeling of the book or the emotional impact of the book out beyond just pure realism. And I already had the Sputnik going over. I'd used that as a sort of symbolic message, if you like, of the outer world, of a larger world, of larger concerns. And I thought eternity could well work as part of this. And as it was almost 9 years after I saw it that I wrote Bobbin Up. I was then able to describe the figure of the writer. And I also wanted to get the feeling of the streets of Sydney and the sort of the characters who inhabited them, the rather bizarre sort of street people.
That shy, mysterious poet, Arthur Stace, whose work was just one single mighty word, walked in the utmost depths of time and space, and there his word was spoken, and he heard, eternity, eternity. It banged him like a bell, dulcet from heaven sounding, somber from hell.
I met him at St. Barnabas, the Broadway. I became the assistant minister there in 1942. He was brought up in Balmain, one of the Balmain boys, you know.
His parents were heavy drinkers, and when his father was badly intoxicated, he was abusive and brutal to the children and his wife.
But he said to me, I never lived in a house. We lived under a house.
Arthur told us that the children would sleep under the house on sacks.
We never paid for our breakfast at any time. He said, with my sister, we used to go out and collect our breakfast from the doorsteps of different homes.
The family would go along, all take a different street and swig some milk.
In those days, the milkman and the baker delivered the bread and the milk.
And we used to swipe, he said, fruit from the fruit shops too.
So far as we were concerned, we didn't worry about whether it was right or wrong. We need to eat.
His parents and family destroyed themselves with alcohol. He said that his 2 sisters were prostitutes. He ran brothels. He had a terrible life. Arthur rarely spoke about his First World War experiences. I think he found them pretty dreadful. And as a stretcher bearer, it must have been no picnic. He was only 5'3", so that meant he wasn't a very good target for the opposing forces. Many people, of course, came back emotionally destroyed, but others did not. Some of them came to a deeper and richer spiritual experience as a result of the war. But it was very terrible, it must have been.
This fellow had been a pretty rough diamond. As a little more than a schoolboy, he'd been in and out of jail for various offences. He'd been a pretty heavy drinker.
He was an alcoholic. He got down as far as drinking boot polish in methylated spirits.
Actually, Arthur told me the meaning of plink. Well, he said, first of all, bad wine is plonk. And plink is bad plonk because it's got methylated spirits added to it. He did get on to plink in a way because he used to drink metho.
Well, he would have said that it almost destroyed him. And as I say, Arthur was an intelligent man. He knew where to find help. Admittedly, it had taken him until 45 years of age to come where he could get help. As a young person, I went to St Barnabas Church in Broadway, and it was there that Arthur came to a Wednesday night men's meeting way back in August 1930. He was a man who was trying very hard. He was 45 years of age. He was destroying himself with alcoholic poisoning.
He told me himself one night, got him aside and told me how that he came into the men's meeting and he saw these men at the front of the hall. Of course, those days there'd be about 300 or 400 men and more in for the Wednesday night meeting. And he saw all these men nicely dressed and discovered it was because they were Christians and that they'd accepted Christ as their Saviour, and they had been, a lot of them had been alcoholics, you see. Well, the result of it was that he said to me, I thought to myself, this'll do me, this'll do me.
Arthur used to say, I went in for a rock cake and came out with the Rock of Ages.
And he said, that night, I didn't accept Christ actually in the hall, but I went to a big Moreton Bay fig tree just outside Grace Brothers on the corner of the Broadway and the street going to Newtown. And I knelt down and I said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner.
If you'd asked Arthur about conversion or salvation, he would have said, well, before I went into St Barnabas Church on that August day in 1930, I was lost, completely out of kilter altogether, the end of my tether. He would say then, my life from then on has been a life of purpose and meaning, and above all, the friendship of Jesus Christ.
Eternal. What a remarkable, uplifting, glorified word, once uttered, because there's only one eternity. And the eternal God is in command of it. I seem to hear it coming out of the past like a distant sound of thunder, bursting with a clap in the present, and rolling on with mumblings and rumblings into the unknown future. Eternity, eternity.
When John Ridley got going, he really rattled the stained glass windows. And that was appreciated in those days.
One day at Burton Street Baptist Tabernacle, my father was preaching on the subject of eternity, and his message was called Echoes of Eternity.
Ridley developed the meaning about eternity, the spiritual dimension of life.
And in the middle of that message, he suddenly shouted, eternity, eternity. Oh, that I could shout and sound eternity all over the streets of Sydney. You have to meet eternity. Where will you spend eternity?
No one was listening more intently than Arthur Stace.
And there was such power in that from the Lord that Arthur Stace really was conscious that the Lord was saying to him, go out and write that word on the streets of Sydney. But he said, how can I? Because I cannot even really write my own name. How can I possibly write eternity? I can't spell it for £100. But he went out and he wrote that word in that beautiful copperplate handwriting outside the church.
And to write eternity in perfect copperplate was nothing short of a miracle. And he realised straight away what had happened to him, something that was other than himself.
It had a religious effect, but nothing to do with Christianity.
It was rather like one of those archetypal sort of messages that come from outer space, you know, and you wonder what it all means. And then when I thought about it, I thought it must be somebody writing it up who's got some kind of religious message.
I see it as an inspired word that he heard at a sermon in Darlinghurst. What interpretation he put on eternity, I have no idea. But nevertheless, it was instrumental in compelling him to go out into the street and write this word like a phantom in the night for 40 years of his life across the face of the city.
It was so nicely done. You know, it had obviously been done with such care and came out with such perfection.
It was a copperplate script, and there was something, of course, in the style of the writing of the word that actually was the aspect of it that was that drew the eye.
It was quite good. It looked like a commercial artist had written it.
I only ever seen it in white chalk.
It was, of course, the word itself, but also the way in which it was written. A way which kind of made walls disappear.
We didn't realise that an actual person had just done it freehand.
A yellowy coloured chalk, always the same colour.
White chalk. And then later on, Arthur graduated to yellow, waterproof chalk.
In fact, early on, we all thought it had been done with one of those tin plates. But I think possibly people took it more seriously because of that.
And then at 57, he married for the first time Pearl, and she was such a wholesome lady. She came from a good country family, and her family were first fleeters.
Arthur was a rather tiny man, and Mrs. Stace was really a very statuesque lady, and she supported all his work.
But he was a very small man and a very jovial man. No doubt about it.
I think the best way to describe Mrs. Stace was a dragon lady with a heart of gold.
Well, she was a very, I thought, a very classical lady. She's a very, very, very lovely looking lady, and well built and quite a joy to the eye as far as men are concerned. She really was a nice lady.
He had this pugnacious little face. I think somewhere along the line he must have been in a fight, probably lots of fights, but somewhere along the line his nose was broken. But I didn't meet up with him until I went to Red Cross headquarters in about 1950, and he was already on the staff there then. He was a cleaner come lift driver. He stayed there until 1955. He was unusual for a cleaner. Mostly they're very casual, you know, open neck shirts and cardigans, something like that. But the thing that struck me most about Mr. Stace was that he was always so beautifully turned out. He was always in a blue serge three-piece suit, collar and tie, and he was the essence of politeness, a very gentle man. He'd go out at lunchtime, always carrying a suitcase, and we used to sometimes wonder, you know, what was in the suitcase, and I think we realise now, having heard that he used to deliver religious tracts around, I think probably that's what was in there.
He was quite a good speaker. Speaking in the open air in corner of Bathurst Street and George Street every Sunday night. He was really good.
Didn't have a big voice. He didn't have to. Once people began to listen, they recognised that here was something out of the box.
If you didn't have a drunk or someone that wanted to abuse you or come up with some smart remark, it wouldn't be a good open-air meeting.
Yes, well, Lyle went to the Saturday night open-air meetings that were run by the church, and Arthur was giving what we call his testimony. Then Lyle went to the place where Arthur was standing, and he saw this word eternity written down, and he knew it hadn't been written there before, and he said to Arthur, "Arthur, are you Mr. Eternity?" Because Eternity was appearing all over Sydney, but people didn't know who it was. And he said, "Guilty, Your Honour." So he said, "You won't tell anyone, will you?" Well, after a time, Lyle persuaded him that it would benefit people. So Arthur wrote the story out of what his life had been like, his parents and his brothers and sisters and all their problems, and then Lyle wrote it up in that little tract, The Crooked Made Straight. Arthur agreed with that title because he felt he was crooked and he was made a straight man. Lyle asked me to bring Arthur in, and I brought him in, and he asked permission to send the tract, The Crooked Made Straight, to Tom Farrell to let the public know that he was Mr. Eternity. And Arthur gave permission, and so Lyle wrote the letter and sent it off to John Farrell, and the following week, Sunday, the Telegraph told the whole story of the mystery that had been solved.
Yes, I was a reporter on the Daily Telegraph, which of course included being a reporter on the Sunday Telegraph. And I was assigned to this by the Chief of Staff of the day. This fellow's signature is pretty well known around where he lives. And if you go to this address, you'll learn all about him. Nobody's ever been able to interview him. This man was now coming out, making himself available for interview because the minister in charge of the church to which he was attached, where he worshipped, I think he was looking probably for a donation. I certainly didn't pass any money to him. I think there must have been some arrangement which had been made by somebody else on the paper.
Well, I've been working with John Fairfax, a newspaper publishers, for 38 years, mainly working on the Sydney Morning Herald and the Sun newspaper. A journalist had found him, this person that no one knew who wrote this word eternity, and brought him into the office to be photographed. And he was a bit of a shadowy figure that could appear and disappear, and the journalist was very concerned that if I was to go out into the street and photograph him, he'd be gone, he'd just vanish again, we'd lose him and we probably wouldn't get any more story out of him. So we wanted to photograph him inside the office while we sort of had him captured. So I thought, well, the best place to make it look like a street but still being inside the office was the stairwell. So we took him down the concrete fire escape, so we had him boxed in both ways.
Constantly in the paper there was a picture of him. There was one in which he was photographed, and he said, I went to church last week and I was able to whip in a few eternities.
All of a sudden the press started doing articles about Arthur and Mr. Eternity, as they called him.
I think he felt that what he was doing was more important than himself. And if he became known as the person who was doing it and became a bit of a celebrity as a result, it would detract from the actual message.
There were, at that time when Arthur was flourishing, a number of eccentric people around the town who had considerable notoriety. And these people who described Arthur that way didn't know him, didn't know anything about his background. He was not. He was a thoroughgoing, reasonable, rational Christian.
Obviously, he was an eccentric, but he'd been changed by the experiences of his time. You know, he'd been through the First World War and the Depression and those things, and permanently altered by those experiences.
No, I don't think so. I think it was a message that God gave to Arthur Stace, because it was absolutely given by the Lord, that ability to write that word. And I feel that he knew it was his mission, and it was what God wanted him to do. And if he hadn't been obedient, that wouldn't have pleased the Lord, and he was obedient. So God really used that little word, I believe, to bless and challenge many.
Pearl discussed with me about Arthur wanting to leave work. She was a little bit cross, and she said, Art wants to leave work and write eternity everywhere. And she said, I don't know whether it does any good. I made no comment, and she said, he'll go on the pension and he'd like to do it all day. And the next week she came up to me and she said, Mrs. Thompson, I told him he could leave work and we'll manage. She said, we won't have as much money, but she said, we'll both go on the pension and he'll give up his job at the Red Cross. And this was the period when Arthur's eternity began to be seen further than the cross in the inner city area. It went out to Campbelltown and to Newcastle. He'd go there in a day, down to Wollongong. And wherever transport went, he could go then because he had a whole day at his disposal. Arthur, of course, had his evening meals with me after his wife died.
He reacted very well, very calmly, and he continued his work somewhat in a reduced way. He was getting on in years then. He was around 81.
It was October in Sydney and very cold. Here's this pictures of South Pacific, you know, like a fantasy on Bali High. I saw this old man sort of doing something. I didn't want to just walk past him, but he had the aura of not wanting to be seen or looked at. I'm sure it irritated him that I stopped, and I could see his reflection in the window, and I waited, and when I finally turned around, he got up, and he didn't look at me, but I was aware that he knew that I was there. The actual process of writing Eternity meant that he sort of he had to kneel almost like in prayer. I just observed that he was terribly old and frail, and it was clear that I almost felt like going over and helping him get up because he was having, feeling pain getting up. And his shoes were far too big for his feet. I noticed that. I could see down into the crack between his shoes and his socks. He had such an aura that you wouldn't go over to him when he was writing. I went over and saw the word of eternity. I thought maybe he'd read my mind and wrote it for me. I didn't know anything about the tradition of Arthur Stace and eternity. But when I saw the word eternity on the footpath, a 15-year-old boy looking for signs, the one word seemed to be like a whole book of words. It seemed to say everything.
One day he came to me in St Peter's Rectory in East Sydney in Darlinghurst. He said, you know, I think that really I'd like to go to the Hammondville homes for senior citizens. He said, I'm not going to give up. I'll never give up writing eternity, but I think the time has come for me to go to a retirement village. I said, righto, let's start the process, and I arranged for him to go to Hammondville. And he spent the last 2.5 years of his life there. On the last Christmas day of his life, I conducted the services at St Peter's East Sydney in the morning and then went up to Hammondville for the chapel service, and he was present and sang quite lustily. Then there was Christmas dinner, which was a great occasion, of course, and then most of the people went off to have a rest. I said to Arthur, are you going to have a rest? No fear, he said. I'm going out to Parramatta. This is a wonderful day for writing eternity. There'll be nobody much in the streets. No policeman to tell me I shouldn't do it, though they never interfered with him. I'm going out to write eternity. That's the kind of man he was. He was indomitable. He was not a fanatic, he was not obsessed, but he had a purpose, and nothing could stop him.
I was in the employ of A.W. Edwards Proprietary Limited as a quantity surveyor and estimator. And in 1963, we were invited to tender for the rebuilding of the GPO clock tower, which had been demolished in 1942. The job was at the stage where we could lift the big hour bell into the tower. On Monday morning, the foreman rang me at the office and told me that this eternity had appeared on the inside of the bell, and it quite obviously had to have been done after it had been lifted. He must have known or noticed that this operation was going on, and I have no hesitation whatsoever to fix it to the man who wrote eternity over practically every footpath everywhere in Sydney.
When we arrived, there was Arthur Stace, very shriveled up and shrunken, his head deep in the pillow, and he was lying at peace. John Ridley bent low and whispered into his ear, "Arthur, Jesus is here." But there was no response. We realised that Arthur was far gone. The City Council vetoed it as far as I can recall because they thought it would be a controversial thing. Now, I would have thought that was a very good thing to do. Sydney Square had only been opened recently, and I was the architect for that and for St Andrew's House. As we were thinking about where would be the best place to put the inscription, I don't know what to call it. It's not a plaque, really, is it? It's not an inscription. It's just a replica. It's a replica of eternity. We wanted to put it somewhere that wasn't too obvious because Arthur did that. I thought it's rather interesting that it's there and it doesn't say anywhere what it is or who's put it there or anything else. I don't have my name up next to it or anything like that. It's exactly the way Arthur would have liked it.
When Sydney lies a-sleeping, I takes me nightly walk. I takes me bag of sandwiches. I takes me piece of chalk. I have a mystic message. I was invited to be in a SUD, Sydney University Dramatic Society review. A friend of mine had written this song about the Eternity Man. And I went along and I auditioned with this piece, and the director fell off his chair with delight and said, well, no, we want you to be in the review provided you do that song. And so I sort of dressed up in a grubby raincoat and a little hat pulled up. Not as a dirty old man, not at all. I mean, we were aware of the sort of the sympathy for the fella. And I remember I had a little brown paper bag because there was the line about I takes me nightly sandwiches, I takes me piece of chalk. And I wandered on stage and I sang the verse, and then I got to the chorus, and the minute I hit the word eternity, the audience just went bananas. Eternity, eternity, from Bondi to Benalong, Killara to the harbour and Coogee to Currajong. And all my life this song has plagued me in the nicest possible way. You know, people stop me in the street and say, "Excuse me, but aren't you the fellow that used to sing Eternity?" Go to parties and people say, "Do the Eternity song." The Catholics get leave to use the pill. He raised his eyes to heaven and answered with a will. He raised his eyes to heaven and answered with a will. In Latin, aeternitas, aeternitas. No matter what the critics may say, contraception is deception, and rhythm will win the day. Contraception is deception, and rhythm will win the day.
Arthur Stace was a very religious man. I mean, he was driven by a Christian imperative. It was a sermon, I think, that he felt he was writing in the streets. And given he inscribed it so often, 500,000 times, I began to think of the way that he'd marked out territory, he'd mapped out a path through Sydney, and it began to me to seem something like a white Christian songline, as it were. It was a way of singing this territory, of proclaiming this territory, and of proclaiming eternity for this territory.
Well, he was the greatest graffiti artist. He was the father of them all. He was the beginning of graffiti, as far as I'm concerned. But meaningful graffiti. One word, like eternity, has far-reaching implications.
I think it was great to see that around Sydney. It really was. It's inoffensive. It gave a message to some people, and written in chalk. A few people walk over it, in a few days it started to fade away, probably itself into eternity, with a bit of rain or wear.
Well, in Arles, Vincent van Gogh had an idea of a yellow house in the sun where an artist community could work and create and live together. And it took a long time for his idea to come true, but it has now come true, and it's not Arles, it's in Australia.
It's part of what I'd see as a sort of language of Sydney. You know, it belongs to the language of Sydney. The thing that really drove it home to me was when it was in the University Review, and that song sort of was striking. I think then it sort of entered into my work after that, really. To put it in as something, you know, it's something I sense eternity's going through, perhaps. When I was doing the big painting for Remo, we'd just drawn it all in. I think we'd painted it in the first sort of draft of it. And it was a huge painting, you know, it was about 20 feet long. I went to bed and was woken up the next morning. I'd left the radio on, fallen asleep with the radio on. I was about 6 o'clock in the morning, came a news flash that Patrick White had died, you know. And I walked downstairs and I went in to look at the painting, and the word had completely gone. It was just painted blue again. Tim, who'd been working on it that night, had not been happy with it and painted over it.
A life is not a life unless it's lived with passion and commitment. Arthur Stace is surely the embodiment of passion near obsession, as is Martin Sharp. Each and every one of them involves a single-minded commitment and constancy. Constancy linking once again in with eternity. Here we have Arthur Stace's passion, Martin Sharp's passion, our customer's passion. The eternity variant that we did was a celebration of passion, and the message we wanted to give people was that it was good to be totally committed, and it was noble to be passionate to the point of obsession, and it was a very positive thing.
It was one painting that I did out of passion, and I thought it was big and heavy and difficult, and really I was amazed. My friend Ronaldo Cameron died of motor neuron disease, and I went to his funeral, and the funeral was incredibly distressing. I spoke at the funeral, but because I had to speak at the funeral, I couldn't express my emotions. When I came home, I couldn't sleep, and I did this drawing. And as I was doing Ronaldo, he and Arthur Stace merged somehow. The bird-like face of Arthur Stace and Ronaldo, and after I finished the drawing, I could sleep. It gave me peace. I think it was the religion that Arthur expressed in that moment on the street came back and helped me cope with the grief of Ronaldo's death. So I did a drawing of Arthur that night when I got home. He affected me so much, it was like putting a tattoo on my soul. And then almost 30 years later, his image came back to help me through my pain. I think there's a visual language in any city. I think art talks and also icons talk, but it's a language you have to learn to read. And it's also a kind of a language where it's got a message which is different for everyone because it's always a different combination. It's like a jumbled sentence. I don't think Arthur Stace would have seen himself as an artist, a writer, or a poet, but he was, because my definition of what those people are people who get a sense of their own destiny and a message that they want to give. In his case, he found the simplest way to do it, which was a single word in chalk on the pavement. But I'm sure he saw himself as an evangelist.
Well, I think of him like Patrick White, you know, in a way that, you know, Patrick did it with lots of words and Arthur did it with one, you know, but basically they're about the same thing. You know.
Now, before he died, he admitted that he'd written that word 500,000 times. That's 500,000 words. Packed into a book, that's one hell of a book. And have gone with the wind to so many words, I don't know. But it makes Stace one of the most prolific writers in this country, and one of the most committed men. To be inspired by one word and repeat that word night after night for 40 years, how many people do you know, or I know, would have that devotion, that commitment, that focus? Commit your life for 40 years.
Eternity, I think, is something like passing through time. Something perhaps bending time, bending reality.
After life, there is another life, that this life is a preparation for eternal life, and that we have to live responsibly so that when we push through that heavy curtain called death, Jesus Christ will not be a stranger to us, but he will be there to greet us.
Forever and ever, I suppose. Space, the great abyss, blackness.
I see it as a vertical thing. I see it as a moment in time embedded in the universal consciousness.
Life is like a parking lot, you know, we're here in this space to learn a few things, and then a door opens and we go to another door.
The best meaning of eternity is the lifetime of the Almighty. That means forever. Tremendous thought. And if one knows the Lord Jesus Christ as Saviour and Lord, then it means the whole of eternity forever with him.
I don't actually believe that people go through into eternity in the religious sense, but I believe, in a certain way, people's spirits or their presence lingers in their absence, and I think that's another way of thinking about eternity.
Eternity. It fades like morning dew, and he is lost in it. Yet one can say, as one can say of few, it was the greatest of all words he wrote, and if it hardly changed this wicked city, God rest his soul, his copper plate was pretty.
Arthur's now become a symbol. He's not a human being anymore. He's a symbol of a lone person who wanted to project our thought out to the universe.
Arthur Stace, curiously, has gone into a kind of eternity because of his word, and his act has lived through time. It's passed through time into another manifestation of Sydney, and so he curiously has perhaps achieved eternity.